The rain didn't fall that day. It held its breath, just like the rest of the town, waiting. It waited for the moment she would finally break, the moment she would run barefoot and breathless through the chapel doors, the satin hem of her wedding dress torn, her eyes wide with an emotion so old it didn't have a name anymore. They found her at the edge of the old orchard, where the apple trees leaned in, like hunched, silent witnesses to a crime they couldn't speak of. She was just standing there, a simple gold wedding ring slipping from her trembling fingers, a suitcase lying unopened at her side. And in the unnatural stillness, you could hear her husband's voice, echoing softly from the house behind her. He was calling her name, not with anger, but with a love so deep it was terrifying. No one in the town of Elridge could understand it. They couldn't understand why she, of all people, would marry a man who was supposed to have only months to live. But then again, no one knew the shadow she had fled to get here. No one knew the secret she had buried so deep inside her it had become a second, frantic heartbeat. The thing is, he was supposed to die. That was the whole point. He wasn't supposed to survive the winter. He wasn't supposed to live long enough to start asking the questions she could never, ever answer. He wasn't supposed to be strong enough to stay, to build a life, to look at her with eyes that saw right through the walls she'd built. But he did. He survived. And worse, so much worse. He loved her. And because he stayed, so did her past, circling like a vulture. This is the story of how one woman's desperate plan for escape backfired in the most beautiful and horrifying way imaginable. And it all started in a town that God himself seemed to have forgotten. The town of Elridge sat like a forgotten breath between two dusty hills. Its streets were paved with gravel and memories that no one dared to speak aloud. The wind here didn't howl, it whispered. It whispered through the cracked shutters of the lonely houses, through the gossamer curtains of the chapel, and through the lips of women who had long forgotten how to smile with their eyes. Every single morning, the same tired sun rose over Elridge, but it never seemed to bring any warmth. Its pale light would catch on chipped picket fences and peeling porch paint, but it never quite reached the dark corners of the town where secrets and people tended to rot. And in one of those dim corners lived a woman named Nora. She moved through the world like someone trying desperately not to be seen. A quiet, unassuming shape in a threadbare brown wool coat, her dark hair always pinned back so tightly it looked like it hurt. Her footsteps were muffled on the gravel roads, as if even the earth itself had agreed to help keep her quiet. Most of the townsfolk didn't remember exactly where she'd come from. The rest of them just pretended not to. Parents would tell their children not to stare at her, but of course they always did. It wasn't just the limp that caught their eyes, though that was part of it. It was the way she never, ever looked up. The way she never smiled, as if joy was a foreign language she had long since forgotten. The limp, they said, came from something she never talked about. An old injury, some whispered. A punishment, others speculated. Maybe just a fall from grace. Everyone in Elridge had their own version of Nora's story. None of them had the truth. Some whispered she was once married, or at least she was supposed to be. Others claimed she'd run from something much darker, something that crossed state lines and stayed up late at night with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a loaded question in the other. They guessed and they gossiped because she gave them nothing else to go on. She was a blank page they were all desperate to write on. She lived in the old boarding house at the very edge of town, room 3, second floor, with a single window that faced the cemetery. That window never opened. The curtains behind it never moved. If she ever cried in that room, no one in the world ever heard her. The grocer, Mr. Gable, noted that she never bought flowers. The librarian, a stern woman named Mrs. Pinter, said she never checked out romance novels. And the preacher, Reverend Michael, would say that she always left church just before the last hymn, slipping out the back door like a ghost. And yet, there was a strange, sad grace in her solitude. There was a kind of discipline in the way she walked alone to the bakery each morning, the way she measured her steps so her limp wouldn't be pitied, only observed. She wasn't asking for anything from anyone, not friendship, not forgiveness, not even a kind word. All she wanted was to be left in silence. But silence in a town like Elridge doesn't last long. It's a commodity more valuable than gold, and just as rare. People started to notice the scar. It was a pale, jagged line just beneath her collarbone, peeking out from above the high neckline of her dress. A permanent, ugly reminder that some wounds even time can't smooth out. They never asked her about it. They only wondered, and their wonderings grew into dark and twisted tales. She kept to herself. Not out of pride, but out of pure preservation. The silence she carried wasn't passive. It was a fortress. It was a wall she had built, brick by painful brick, to hold back a flood of memories that threatened to drown her. No friends ever came knocking on her door. No letters ever arrived for her at the post office. On Sundays, while the rest of the town gathered in the pews for prayer and gossip, she would sit alone on the chapel's very last bench, her head bowed, not in reverence, but in retreat. And yet, even the loneliest soul hears things on the wind. A cough behind a closed door. A voice that sounds like your name, though you know it's not really there. And then, there was the rumor. A rumor that a stranger was coming to Elridge, a man with pale skin and tired, knowing eyes. A man who, they said, was dying. They said he had a short time left. A heart too weak, or lungs too brittle, or some other ailment that had marked him for an early grave. And they said he had money. Lots of it. Maybe from the war, some guessed. Maybe from something much worse. The town stirred like dust before a summer storm. A dying man coming to a quiet place like Elridge to meet his end wasn't that unusual. It happened from time to time. But this one, he was coming alone. And he was looking to get married. And that's when they all started looking at Nora differently. Their glances became sharper, more calculating. Suddenly, her tragic, silent presence in their town made a different kind of sense. She wouldn't, someone said at the general store. She might, another replied over a fence post. She's desperate, she's cursed, she's perfect for him. No one spoke to her about it directly, of course. That wasn't the Elridge way. They communicated in sideways glances and small, unusual kindnesses. Mrs. Callahan from the bakery offered her a fresh apple pie, just because. Mr. Wren, the postman, gave her 2 stamps instead of 1, with a knowing little nod. The town never gave anything without a reason, and Nora knew exactly what they were thinking. They were thinking that she might just do it, that she might just be broken enough, just desperate enough, to marry a dying man. To let her own past be buried right alongside him in someone else's grave. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that she had already considered it. Not out of cruelty, and not even for the money. She considered it for something much, much colder. Escape. You see, Nora didn't believe in starting over. She didn't believe in second chances. She just wanted to disappear, to become someone else's quiet, respectable memory instead of her own living, breathing punishment. There were nights she would stand at the edge of the river that cut through the valley, watching the dark water slide over the smooth, gray rocks with the patience of centuries. She had thought more than once about just walking into it. Just walking until the current took her, until the weight of the water was heavier than the weight of her past. But she always turned back, because she wasn't really afraid of dying. She was afraid of being found. What she carried inside of her was so much heavier than grief. It was the bone-deep knowledge that someone, somewhere, still remembered what she did, and even worse, what she didn't do. So when she heard about him, the man with only weeks to live, a house on the hill, and no family to mourn his passing, she didn't ask a single question. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked straight into the mayor's office, her head held high, and said the 5 words that would change everything. "I'll marry him." No one in that town expected it to be so fast. No one expected her to be the one to speak first. And certainly, no one, least of all Nora, expected him to live. The wind changed the day he arrived. It wasn't a sudden, violent shift, but a subtle one, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The dust on Elridge's main street didn't stir the same way. The crows that perched on the chapel roof didn't cry as often. Even the little brass chimes on the bakery door seemed to ring off-tempo, as if they were caught in thought. He came on foot, not in a carriage. That in itself was strange. A man with means, dying or not, would usually arrive with a certain amount of fuss. A nurse, a large trunk, perhaps a lawyer trailing behind with folded hands and an air of quiet pity. But this one came utterly alone. His name was Elias. He was tall, almost too tall for someone who was said to be wasting away. He wore a simple gray coat that had clearly once been expensive, but was now softened at the sleeves by time and wear. His shoes were polished, but his walk was heavy, deliberate, as if each step he took required a conscious act of will. He didn't go to the mayor's office to announce his arrival. He didn't check into the boarding house. He simply arrived, and he stayed. The first time Nora saw him was from her second-story window. He was standing outside the apothecary, speaking to no one, just staring at the thick green ivy that was crawling up the side of the old brick building. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to blink. It was as though he was remembering something that hadn't even happened yet. A strange, prophetic stillness surrounded him. Later that day, she saw him again at the chapel. He was sitting in the 4th pew from the front, not in the back where the wanderers and the town drunks usually hid themselves away. His hands rested lightly on his lap, the way someone might hold a prayer they weren't quite ready to speak aloud. He didn't look at her. Not then. But that changed soon enough. It happened on a Tuesday, when the town market was nearly empty, and the clouds hung low in the sky like wet gray wool. Nora was at the fruit stand, selecting pears from a half-rotten crate, when a shadow moved beside her. She reached for a piece of fruit, and at the exact same moment, so did he. Their hands didn't touch, not quite. But something else did. A flicker of recognition, a pause that was heavier than a touch. It wasn't electricity, no, nothing so simple as that. It was something older, something deeply familiar. A recognition without a name. "Take it," she said. Her voice hadn't been used yet that morning, and it rasped like dry paper. He didn't take the pear. "Only if you don't want it," he replied. His eyes weren't on the fruit. They were on her. She hesitated. People in Elridge didn't talk to her like that. Not with gentleness. Not like she was a real person with wants and needs. It was unsettling. She left the pear behind and walked away. He didn't pick it up either. That night, the wind blew harder than it had in months. The window in her small room rattled in its frame. She didn't sleep a wink. They crossed paths again the next morning at the town well, then again near the church, then once more behind the library, where the wild wisteria grew in thick, tangled vines. Each time, it was nothing more than a nod, a brief glance. Once, he said, "Good morning." She didn't answer him, but she didn't walk away as quickly as she usually would have either. It was their 4th meeting that finally broke the suffocating silence between them. He found her standing by the old stone wall that bordered the cemetery. "You limp," he said. His voice was gentle. There was no judgment in it, no pity. It was just a simple statement of fact. She bristled, her defenses rising instantly. "So do ghosts," she retorted, her words sharp as a shard of glass. He smiled at that, a slow, sad smile that reached his tired eyes. Then I'm in good company, he said. They said nothing more that day, but that was enough. A seed had been planted. By the end of the week, the entire town had noticed. Mrs. Alder at the bakery whispered to a customer, "He lingers when she's near." Mr. Grimby, sorting letters at the post office, muttered to himself, "Didn't think she could even talk." And little Ellie Hart, a girl who watched everyone with her wide, hungry eyes, asked her mother in a loud voice, "Is Miss Nora allowed to be smiled at?" The town's suspicion didn't come from a place of pure cruelty. Not entirely. It came from fear, a deep, unsettling fear of change, a fear that maybe, just maybe, they had misjudged her all this time, a fear that this dying man might uncover something that they had all worked so hard to ignore and keep buried. Because Elridge, for all its suffocating silence, was a town built on a foundation of secrets, and one unearthed secret always threatens to unravel all the rest. One evening, under the sprawling sycamore tree by the chapel, Elias spoke to her again, this time with more words. "I heard you said yes," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the still evening air. She didn't ask him how he knew. Gossip moved faster than truth in this town. It was the only thing that did. "I did," she replied. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "Why?" he asked. She could have lied. She could have said it was for his money, or out of pity for a dying man, or because she was desperately lonely. But for some reason, she felt that this man, this stranger, deserved more than a simple lie. He deserved a piece of the truth. "I needed to leave something behind," she said, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. Even if it meant burying it in someone else's name. He nodded slowly. It wasn't a nod of agreement, but one of profound understanding. "I needed to be found," he said, his own voice heavy with a past she couldn't see. "Even if it meant being buried next to someone I never knew." Neither of them spoke for a long while after that. They just sat there under the ancient tree, two lonely ghosts, as the shadows stretched long and thin, until it was too dark to ignore anymore. The townsfolk didn't like it. Not one bit. Mrs. Ketterly, the mayor's wife, insisted that Elias was being manipulated by a cunning, broken woman. The preacher hinted from his pulpit that Nora surely had sinister plans. And old Mr. Dover, who sat on his porch all day, said that she must have put a curse on the man. Because Elias, against all odds and every whispered rumor, was starting to look healthier. And truth be told, he did. He began walking farther each day, his step a little lighter. He started smiling more, and one afternoon Nora even heard him laugh near the general store. It was a sound so unexpected, so out of place in the grim tapestry of Elridge, that it sent a shockwave through the town. No one had expected that, least of all Nora, because somewhere in those shared silences and half-spoken truths, something incredibly fragile and terrifying had begun to bloom between them. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something that made love possible. It wasn't desire, but it was a form of grace. One night, as the sky turned that aching shade of deep navy just before the stars blink awake, Nora stood at her window. She looked down and saw Elias standing outside on the street below, not moving, just standing there in the gloom, looking up at the single light in her window. She didn't move. She didn't wave. But for the first time, she didn't close the curtains either. Then came the letter. It was unmarked, left on the chapel bench where she always sat. It was addressed only to her, in a single, stark word, Nora. She read it once. Then she read it again, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The handwriting was too neat, too deliberate. The ink was too fresh. "You can marry him," the note said, "but you can't outrun what you did. Not here. Not anywhere. People forget, but I don't. A friend." She folded the letter carefully, as if the sharp creases could somehow hide the poison in its meaning. The next morning, she took it out behind the boarding house and burned it in an old coffee can. But the wind was restless that day, and it wouldn't let the ashes stay down. The trouble began with the dress. It was a pale blue thing, simple but lovely. She had sewn it herself in the quiet, stolen hours before sunrise, when the rest of the town was still asleep and her hands were steady enough for a needle and thread. It was meant for their wedding, not a grand affair, just an honest one. Just theirs. But the morning she placed it on the clothesline to air out, it vanished. At first, she thought the wind had taken it. It had been a cruel, howling wind the night before. But no, the clothespin was still there on the line, snapped cleanly in half. It was deliberate. She found it later that day. Not the whole dress, but pieces of it. They were tacked to the heavy oak doors of the chapel, hung there like a grotesque warning. The beautiful blue fabric had been torn in half, and it was smeared with something dark and viscous. Not blood, but the kind of thick black ink used to stain truths and sign away lives. Someone had used white chalk to scrawl a message across the largest piece of fabric. You don't get to start over. And suddenly, the oppressive silence of Elridge felt louder and more threatening than any scream. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't run to tell Elias. Instead, she just vanished. She packed nothing. She left no note. She simply walked out of her room, down the stairs, past the bakery, past the town well, beyond the cemetery gate, and into the old dark woods where the winter snow still slept in the deepest shadows. The wind followed her, whispering through the pines. The biting cold sank deep into her bones. She didn't run. She drifted, like a ghost returning to the place where it had died. Night came on fast in those woods, the kind of suffocating starless night that presses down on your lungs, thick and endless. She found herself in a small clearing she hadn't meant to find, ringed with frost-touched trees and a silence that was even deeper and more profound than the one she had known in town. Her breath came in sharp, white clouds. Her knees finally buckled. She didn't faint. She just folded, like a piece of paper that had been written on, crumpled up, and then discarded. She lay there on the frozen ground, not asleep, not awake, but trapped in a terrible space in between. And in that space, she remembered all the things she had fought so hard to bury. The face of the child she never got to name, the smell of smoke and the heat of a fire no one in her old town ever tried to put out, the cruel, handsome face of the man who had called her a curse right before disappearing into the night with every last coin she had left in the world, and beneath it all, his final whispered words, the words that had become the soundtrack to her life. You're nothing. You always were. When Elias found her, he said nothing. He didn't gasp in shock. He didn't shout her name like they do in the storybooks. He just knelt beside her in the snow, removed his own thick wool coat, and wrapped it gently around her shivering shoulders. He was careful not to touch her skin, as if he knew, instinctively, that she wasn't ready to be held, but that she desperately needed warmth just the same. Then he just sat beside her on the cold, hard ground, and waited. The stars moved across the black sky. The wind cried its lonely song through the trees, and still, he waited. At some point, in a voice that was barely there, she whispered, "Why did you come for me?" His own voice was just as quiet, a soft murmur in the vast darkness. "Because you didn't say goodbye." They stayed like that, two broken souls in the heart of the woods, until the dawn finally broke the sky into pale, fragile pink threads. When she finally found the strength to stand, he didn't offer her his hand. He just rose beside her, matching her slow, painful pace. Step by careful step. No hurry, no judgment, and no questions. Back in town, the rumors bloomed like rot on a fallen log. "She ran off again," they whispered. "She always breaks things. Bet she's pregnant. Bet it's not his." Elias didn't defend her, not with words anyway. He walked with her right through the town square, his head held level, his gaze steady. He stopped at the bakery, bought a loaf of fresh bread, and handed it to her without a glance at the gawking faces around them. He paused by the chapel doors, the same doors where her dress had been desecrated, and he let her walk in first. And somehow, that quiet, steady defiance said more than any angry speech ever could. That evening, in their small, quiet room above the apothecary, she finally spoke. She stood by the window looking out at the town that hated her, and said, "They hung the pieces of my dress on the chapel doors, like a warning." He turned from the small mirror where he'd been trying to shave, his movements slow and deliberate. "I know," he replied softly. "I'm the one who took them down." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw past the sickness, past the rumors, to the man underneath. "Do you still want to marry me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He walked across the small room to her, stopping just close enough for her to see the mist of his breath in the cool air. "I don't want to marry you because I think you're perfect," he said, his voice low and intense. "And I don't want to marry you because I believe you need me to save you. I want to marry you because you still have a fire burning in your chest, even after everything. And I would rather spend what's left of my life watching that fire burn than sit alone in a warm, empty room without it." Her own voice broke then, not into sobs, but into something much gentler, much more fragile. A question whispered not to him, but to her own bruised and battered soul. Could this be real? And then she said the words that had been buried so deep inside her. "They all thought I was broken." He reached out and gently touched the cold window glass where her reflection shimmered, pale and ghost-like. "Maybe," he said softly. But someone saw the gold glinting in the ashes. But their shared hope was a fragile thing, and the world wasn't done trying to break them yet. A new shadow was falling over Elridge, one from a past she thought was long dead and buried. And this one had a name. The land they chose was unforgiving. It was 3 acres of red clay and stubborn rock on the windy edge of the ridge, with a wind that howled like a grieving widow every single dusk. But it was theirs. There was no fence, no house yet, just the humble, defiant beginning of something bold. They built it with their bare hands and their bruised hearts, one stone at a time, one nail, one shared, exhausted breath. Elias's limp seemed to get worse in the damp cold. The chill had crept deep into his bones and made a permanent home there. But he never let it stop him. He worked from sunup to sundown, his jaw set with a quiet determination that Nora had never seen in any man before. She, in turn, kept a fire going day and night, not just in the makeshift hearth of their lean-to, but a fire of hope between them. She cooked, she stitched their worn clothes, and she whispered the names of the hardy plants that would grow in this stubborn soil once the frost finally gave up its ghost. Together, they planted seeds of hope in ground that had never known it. The town, of course, didn't forget about them. They couldn't. Every Sunday, when Nora and Elias walked into town for supplies, they walked past the same suspicious eyes, the same venomous whispers. "He's still with her. Poor man's completely lost his mind. She's cursed, you know. You just wait and see." But Nora no longer flinched. Not because the words didn't cut her anymore, but because now she had someone to hold the wound with her. And she was beginning to see that he had his own scars, too. Not all of them were visible. One afternoon, as they were stacking wood behind their half-built barn, a rider came up the dusty trail. He had a dusty black hat, clean black gloves, and a sheriff's badge on his chest that was far too clean and shiny to be trusted. Elias saw him first. He didn't move a muscle. He just straightened his back slowly and let the hammer in his hand fall with a soft thud into the dirt. The man's voice was smooth as polished river stone, but the words he spoke were sharp and jagged. Heard a woman lives up here now, he said, not looking at Elias, but scanning the half-finished cabin. One with a bit of a history in 3 counties. Elias said nothing. He just stood there, a silent, unmovable wall. It was Nora who stepped forward. Not behind Elias, but right beside him. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm healing." The lawman raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Healing's fine," he drawled, "long as it doesn't get in the way of justice." Then he tipped his hat, turned his horse around, and left. But the dust he had stirred up didn't settle for days. It hung in the air, a gritty promise of trouble to come. That night, Elias sat quiet by the fire for a long time, a worn, folded letter open in his lap. Nora could see his hands were trembling, but it wasn't from the cold or from his illness. It was from memory. "Was that sheriff here about me?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "No," he said heavily. "It was about us." Then he held the letter up to the firelight, and she saw the official seal at the top. It was a warrant. But it wasn't for her. It was for him. "I ran once, too," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I deserted. From a war I didn't believe in. I left good men behind. I spent 5 years in a military hospital pretending to be someone else, pretending to be sicker than I was, just to stay hidden." The air between them turned cold, but it wasn't with blame. It was with the sharp, sudden breath of a shared, painful truth. She looked at him, at his tired face and his haunted eyes, and she didn't feel fear or betrayal. She felt a profound, aching sense of recognition. "You ran," she said softly, "and you lived." She took a breath. "I ran," she added, "and I survived." Then they just sat there in the flickering firelight, in a silence that was deeper than words. 2 ghosts, finally learning how to be alive again. The storm broke that very night, a storm unlike any Elridge had seen in a generation. The thunder wasn't a rumble. It was like cannon fire, shaking the very foundations of their half-built home. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid gray sheets, like spilled, endless grief. The roof they had worked so hard on didn't hold. The water poured in, and the precious seeds they had planted in the garden were washed away in a river of mud. Nora stood barefoot in the cold mud, watching their work, their hope, crumble under the wrath of the sky. Elias tried to pull her back inside the leaking lean-to, but she wouldn't move. "This is what they all said would happen," she shouted over the roar of the wind, the words torn from her throat, "that everything I touched would eventually rot." He didn't argue with her. He didn't shout back. He simply stepped out into the raging storm beside her, held her face in his 2 strong, calloused hands, and said, "Then let it rot. We'll build it again, and again, and again after that, until even the earth itself knows that you belong here." They spent the next week rebuilding. For the first 2 days, no words were spoken between them. There was just work, just the steady rhythmic motion of hammering and sawing and lifting. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of a shared, unspoken resolve. On the 7th night, as they sat by the fire, exhausted but triumphant, she whispered into the quiet, "I never asked you why you really stayed." He looked up from the fire, his face lit amber and soft in the glow. "Because the first time I saw you," he said, his voice full of a strange reverence, "you weren't just surviving, you were burning, and I just wanted to stand in the fire with you." But peace, she was learning, never comes without a final, terrible reckoning. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was carried by the postman, stamped with a fancy wax seal, and signed with a name she had worked for 10 long years to erase from her memory. Her first husband. The man she thought was dead. The man who had left her to burn. He wasn't dead. He wasn't gone. He was alive, and he was coming. The wind carried his name through the town before the man himself ever arrived, Jonas Talcott, the husband everyone, including Nora, thought was long dead. The one who had vanished in a blaze of fire and lies, leaving behind a mountain of debts and a town full of whispers. Now he rode into Elridge on a fine black horse, with polished boots and a mouthful of righteous claims. "I came for my wife," he announced in front of the general store, his voice loud and booming, making sure the whole town could hear. "She belongs to me by law." Nora was standing in the doorway of the blacksmith's shop, her apron dusted with ash, her hands trembling but steady. She had been helping the blacksmith mend a broken plow. Elias, hearing the commotion, stepped out of the shop to stand beside her, as silent and solid as an old oak tree. A crowd began to form instantly. This was what the townsfolk had been waiting for: a scandal, a reckoning, the final dramatic act in the tragedy of Nora. Jonas pointed a gloved finger directly at her, treating her like a piece of property he had come to reclaim. "Tell him, Nora," he commanded. "Tell this broken-down ghost who you really are." She didn't flinch. Not anymore. She had run out of flinches. "I am the woman who buried you in her heart 10 years ago," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I am the one who stopped breathing every time someone mentioned the word fire or prison." "And now?" Jonas challenged, a cruel sneer on his handsome face. She reached out and took Elias's hand, her fingers lacing through his. She didn't look at Jonas again. "Now," she said, her eyes on Elias, "I'm remembering how to live." They stood there in the middle of the town square, 3 people, 1 terrible truth, and the entire town of Elridge watching, holding its collective breath. Jonas let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You think he's better? This crippled deserter with nothing to his name but a patch of dead land and a warrant for his arrest?" He had clearly done his homework, but Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He only said, his voice calm and level, "She's not something to be owned. She is someone I choose." Then he turned, his voice getting louder, addressing not just Jonas, but the entire town. "And I choose her. Here, now, and always. If that makes me a fool in your eyes, then let it be known." The silence that followed that declaration was different. It was a silence that cracked something deep in the town's cold, judgmental spine. Old Mrs. Callahan from the bakery, the one who had given Nora the pie, nodded her head slowly. A young boy tugged on his father's coat, a look of confusion on his face, and the preacher's wife, a woman known for her sharp tongue, muttered to her husband, "Let them be." Jonas saw the tide turning. He saw the shift in the crowd's eyes from hungry curiosity to a reluctant, grudging respect for the couple standing before them. He turned away with a scoff, the kind of dismissive sound that only a man who has been thoroughly defeated by dignity can muster. He got back on his fine horse and rode out of town without another word. But Nora knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. Men like Jonas Talcott don't just give up. A month later, under a sky so clear it looked like it was dusted with diamond dust, Nora and Elias were married. There was no music, no white dress, no grand celebration. Just the soft light of the fire in their newly finished home, quiet voices, and hands held steady. She wore a sprig of wild lavender tucked behind her ear. He wore the same old gray coat he'd had on the day he first saw her. The preacher, who had come up to the ridge at their request, simply asked, "Do you promise?" And Elias, looking only at Nora, answered, "I already did." They didn't invite the town to their wedding, but in a way, the town came to them. Over the next few days, people made the trek up the rocky path to their cabin, leaving baskets of bread, jars of preserves, and quilts folded in a silent, unspoken apology. One little girl, the one who had asked if Nora was allowed to be smiled at, brought them a small bouquet of wildflowers and said, "I don't think you're scary anymore." But Nora's past wasn't done with her. and Jonas was a man who knew how to use the law as a weapon. One crisp autumn morning, as Elias was chopping wood, two riders appeared on the trail. It was the same sheriff with the too shiny badge, and this time Jonas Talcott was riding right beside him, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Elias Thorne," the sheriff said, dismounting from his horse. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for the crime of desertion from the United States Army." Elias didn't even look surprised. He just lowered his axe slowly and placed his hands on his head. Nora ran out of the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can't do this!" she cried. "Oh, I can, little lady," the sheriff said, pulling out a pair of iron handcuffs. "The law is the law, and your new husband is a wanted fugitive." Jonas just sat on his horse, looking down at her with cold, victorious eyes. "I told you, Nora," he said. "You belong to me, and if I can't have you, then no one will, especially not this coward." And in that moment, Nora was faced with a choice. She could stand by and watch the only man who had ever shown her true kindness be dragged away in chains, his life destroyed because of her. Or she could finally, after 10 long years, unleash the full and terrible truth. The truth she had kept buried so deep, it had nearly rotted her from the inside out. The truth about the fire. She took a deep breath, the cold autumn air burning her lungs. "He's not the only fugitive here, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power. The sheriff paused, his hand hovering over Elias's wrist. "What's that supposed to mean?" Nora looked directly at Jonas, her eyes locking onto his. "It means you should ask my first husband, Mr. Talcott, why he's wanted for arson and murder in the state of Missouri." Jonas's smirk vanished. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "She's lying! She's a hysterical, crazy woman!" "Am I?" Nora shot back, taking a step forward. "Am I crazy, Jonas, or do you just not want the sheriff to know that you were the one who set fire to our boarding house 10 years ago? The fire that you told everyone I had died in?" The sheriff looked from Nora to a suddenly pale Jonas. "Arson? Murder?" "He was trying to collect the insurance money," Nora continued, the words pouring out of her now, a flood of truth that could no longer be contained. "But our infant son was asleep in his crib upstairs, our little boy, Daniel." Her voice broke on his name, a name she hadn't said aloud in a decade. "I tried to get to him, but Jonas held me back. He told me it was better this way. He said the boy was weak, just like me." She pulled down the collar of her dress, revealing the angry, jagged scar that lay just above her heart. "He gave me this scar when I tried to run back into the flames. He held me down and watched it burn. Watched our son die. Then he took the money and disappeared, leaving everyone to believe that both mother and child had perished in the blaze. The air on the ridge was dead silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped to listen. "She's making it up," Jonas stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "There's no proof." "Isn't there?" Nora said softly. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age and soot. "This was Daniel's. I grabbed it from his crib just before Jonas dragged me out. It has his initials engraved on the back." She held it out to the sheriff. He took it, turned it over in his gloved hand, and saw the faint, tiny letters. D.T. Jonas Talcott made a run for it. He spurred his horse, trying to bolt down the trail, but Elias, moving with a speed no one thought he possessed, tackled him, pulling him right off his horse and into the dirt. The fight was short and brutal. In the end, it was Jonas who was put in the iron handcuffs, his face pressed into the red clay he had tried to ruin. Years passed, like the gentle wind through the tall summer grass on the ridge. Elias, as it turned out, was officially pardoned for his desertion after Nora testified on his behalf, explaining the circumstances of their meeting and the threat posed by Jonas Talcott. The story of their love and defiance became a local legend, a cautionary tale against judgment and a testament to the resilience of the human heart. They built a porch on their cabin, a porch where the morning sun landed first, warming the wood. They planted flowers that dared to bloom in the rocky soil, bright patches of color where no one thought anything could grow. And one winter, when a soft, quiet snow blanketed the ridge, Nora gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. He had his father's soft eyes and his mother's quiet, steady breath. They named him Jonah, not after her monstrous past, but after what she had managed to survive. She never told her son the whole dark story. He didn't need to carry that weight. But every single night, as she tucked him into his warm bed, she would whisper to him, "You were born from ashes and from love. You are what we built when the whole world told us not to even try." She was never a curse. She was never broken. She was just someone's miracle, waiting all along to be found. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of survival, justice, and the incredible power of hope. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think is stronger, the secrets we keep or the love that sets them free?